Hello everybody, my name is Brady and we are back with another React video, and today we're going to be checking out more from Extra History. We're continuing the series on Justinian and Theodora, which should be a lot of fun. I know I said I was going to try to get this series done fast. That hasn't really happened. You know, you make plans, but then life happens. But we're here, which means we're making some sort of progress, so we're going to continue this. So we got a little bit of character from Theodora last time, which was really cool. She's undeniably powerful. And that's cool, that's badass. But then, on the other hand, she communicates it in such a way that is so elitist that it's kind of lame. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, if somebody else was like, I would rather be dead than be like an ordinary poor person, you would be like, okay, you're kind of lame and unrelatable. So while Theodora has that badassery by virtue of her position and how she clings on to it, there's also kind of a lameness to it. So, you know, I'm mixed. We'll see how I feel about her going forward. And maybe that was just that one moment of communication. But I do like her strength in that moment of pressure. That is really cool. Then we have this uprising, which kind of has some lame elements too. Like, on the face of it, I know there's probably more to it than is communicated here, but we look at it and it's like these people are doing an uprising over what is essentially a sports hero, and it seems that the sports heroes might have actually done, it seems like they were guilty of what they were convicted of. And then this uprising happens. And honestly, on the face of it, that seems kind of lame, but there may be some underlying resentment, and this is probably just the straw that broke the camel's back, so I'm not really gonna jump on that too much. I'd imagine you don't get here without underlying resentment. Like, these guys over here who you look up to or whatever, they're important, but there's probably more stuff here that pushed people into that. I'm sure it's a diverse number of reasons. So let's get this started. I'm curious to how this is gonna go.
As smoke drifted over the city, there was a silence in Constantinople. The sort of silence that can only come after riot and clangor and death. Large swaths of the city had been burnt to the ground. People wandered the streets, looking for lost loved ones or picking through the wreckage for smoke-blackened belongings. But as Justinian looked out from his palace, over the guards repairing the gate, over the soldiers taking bodies from the hippodrome, he knew a new and greater Constantinople would rise from these ashes, and with it a new and greater Rome. 39 days after the riots, 39 days after the fire and the chaos, the first bricks were set on what would stand for 1,000 years as the greatest Christian church in the world. Where the old Hagia Sophia had collapsed and been gutted by flames just a few scant weeks earlier, a church 100 times more magnificent began to rise. Treasure from all over the empire flowed into the capital to adorn its walls and to pay its workers. The city as a whole united to reconstruct what they had destroyed. And as the walls of the Hagia Sophia began to rise, Justinian set his mind to his last great project, the reconquest of what had been lost in the West.
So, like, just the infrastructure that would still be in place today, that's always some of the more impressive things to read about, because you do have the potential to actually see these things in real life. It's a very tangible look at history when you end up looking at that sort of stuff. When you look at armies of the past or leaders of the past, that's one thing, but when you look at the things that still stand today, there is something very fun about that, and something so reachable in history. When you study history, you want to be able to reach into the past and really feel it, make it as real as possible, and sometimes that's difficult. There are different figures that are not very relatable, but one thing that is very relatable, things you can see, things you can touch, and I love that there's a little bit of emphasis on that in the beginning here, so that's kind of cool.
He was the emperor of Rome, not merely Greece or Anatolia. A bare 60 years ago, the West had fallen. There were still men who lived in the empire who remembered when Rome stretched from Asia to the far coasts of Gaul. It was time to revive that legacy, time to take back what was lost. And to do this, he had to start with North Africa. The North African provinces had always been some of Rome's most stable and prosperous territories. They had been immune to the turbulence in Europe and the Germanic invasions. They weren't ravaged by constant war or desolated by raids. But in the 430s, Vandal kings had crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and marched east, laying siege to Carthage, that ancient enemy Rome had conquered and occupied more than 500 years ago, and taking...
The fun thing about this region here, I've recently been learning a little bit more. This little part right here, this is probably one of the most geographically underrated points in the world. Like right here. Yeah, we've got a Spain, which that would be Spain, right? Not Portugal. I believe this part would be part of modern Spain, and Portugal would start like a little bit over to the side. But like I can't tell, the map's a little bit morphed. But right here, I'm surprised that this wasn't something that was more famously fought over, because like this is control over the Mediterranean right here, and I don't know why I've heard so few stories about it. Recently, I read about a settlement there during the British Empire on the African side, and it just totally didn't work out. But I'm kind of surprised. Like there must be more stories behind like this geographic point, because like yeah, you both have access to the two continents there. So if you had control over this area over here, you have access to the two continents and control over the Mediterranean. But a lot of the fighting goes a little bit more east, seemingly, which is weird. I'd never really understood that.
To Carthage, that ancient enemy Rome had conquered and occupied more than 500 years ago, and taking it as the seat for their new kingdom. But those kings had found more than a capital there. In Carthage, they found a navy. The great shipyard of Carthage fell to the Vandals, and with it, much of the Roman fleet. This allowed the Vandals to become pirates, then raiders, then seaborne conquerors. And in time, most of the Mediterranean islands, even Sicily itself, fell to Vandal arms. But most shocking to the Roman world was an event that had happened in the year 455. In 455, the Vandals descended on Rome itself and sacked it for 14 days. This had led to the last great combined effort of the East and the West, when, in 468, they sent a force of over 100,000 men to retake the North African provinces, and in one of the worst military disasters of the ancient world, were utterly wiped out. After that, an uneasy peace formed between the Vandals and the Romans. Justinian needed to break this peace if he was to restore the glory of Rome, if he was to retake what had been taken from them, and avenge the humiliating sack of the Holy City. But even in ancient times, declaring war still required a reason, or a casus belli. The most recent Vandal king had been pro-Orthodox and friendly to Rome, so Justinian bided his time, marshaling his forces and putting his capital back together. But then, in 533, an opportunity came. Gelimer, the cousin of the Vandal...
Like he wants to reunite things, but this seems to be like a necessary buffer period there. Like even if he wanted to take everything back, like at the beginning of this, like I don't think they would have been like militarily prepared. Like when a nation goes through that much domestic turmoil, you don't want to just jump immediately into another conflict. I mean, there are some cases where it's like, oh, this conflict will rally people behind the leader if things go well, but you probably don't want to go for anything too ambitious until you have a little bit of stability there. So like I kind of get, like it has him like grunting like, oh, I wanted you to blah, 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 but then he has to wait. But the waiting is probably going to make him a little bit more powerful. Like the emphasizing of like building up his army. Yeah, it's good for you to be patient. Build your army a little bit. You wait till you're ready, man. You're gonna be great one day.
King was afraid that the Vandals, who mostly believed in Arian Christianity, were on their way to becoming subjects of the Orthodox Roman Empire, and rallied a group of like-minded nobles behind him to overthrow the Vandal king. Justinian demanded the legitimate king's restoration. Gelimer flatly refused. Now Justinian had a reason for war.
Yeah.
Even as he armed Belisarius with 16,000 men and a fleet 600 ships strong, Justinian himself began to fight a diplomatic war. He knew that to win with 16,000 troops where 100,000 men and the combined arms of two empires had failed, he would need to give himself all the advantages he could. He got both Tripolitania, the eastern part of the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, and Sardinia to revolt. As luck would have it, Gelimer sent his fleet off to deal with the uprising in Sardinia, clearing the seas for Belisarius' fleet, and allowing them to land in Africa unnoticed. Avoiding naval conflict and establishing a beachhead meant that the Eastern Roman fleet had already achieved the tasks which had given the earlier, larger Roman force the most difficulty. But there was still much of Africa to retake. Belisarius' men started to ravage the countryside looking for food and loot, but Belisarius reined them in, demonstrating the second non-violent part of the reconquest strategy. He told his men that everything they took was to be paid for. He told his men that they were liberators, not conquerors, and that the populace were to be treated like Romans, because they were Romans, just living under the Vandal yoke. And with that, he won over the local populace.
I mean, that's really important. Whenever we look at military history, it's so easy to look at it as, like, things on a chessboard. Like pieces on a chessboard. You can, oh, you have this now? Okay, that's all your stuff, and you can move all this stuff as you want and make everything work to your better. But like, what if you were playing a game of chess where your pieces could work against you if you don't treat them well? Like, that's more what war is like. So I kind of like this. This is fun. Like, the ways that conquerors or whatever, like, appeal to the people that they conquer, because eventually you have to do that. I feel like sometimes the ordinary person gets so dehumanized, and their political power gets so underplayed, especially the further back you go. It feels like the world only consisted of these, like, great leaders, and like all these people weren't, like, thinking for themselves. They have their own issues, so I'm glad that this guy seems to have a conqueror's mindset. And he says, like, a liberator, not conqueror, but, like, yeah, that's a good conqueror's mindset. Being able to appeal to the people, convince the people that you conquering them is the right thing.
Towns were opened to him. Grain and water were readily sold to his troops. He could start marching northwest up the coast. He would need to cover 150 miles to make it from their landing site to Carthage. But by now, word had reached Gelimer of the arrival of the invasion force. Gelimer sent word to his brother to gather their forces and meet him south of the capital. He had a plan. He knew that anyone marching on the capital would have to march through a valley 10 miles east of the city itself. His brother would bring the garrison from the capital and use his smaller force to pin the Byzantines in the valley, where they couldn't bring their numbers to bear, while Gelimer would move his larger force in from where they were stationed in the southeast and attack the Romans from behind. Belisarius would have been taken totally by surprise, but Gelimer's brother got to the valley just as Belisarius' advanced guard were scouting it, and this elite cavalry guard not only got word back to Belisarius that something was up, but they also smashed the out-of-position Vandals, killing Gelimer's brother and chasing the remaining troops almost to the walls of Carthage. Gelimer, having no idea that this had happened, charged his forces into the Byzantines from the rear. But since they weren't pinned down by the other Vandal troops in the valley, the Byzantines could wheel around and meet the attack. Despite this, though, the Vandals began to get the better of the day, pushing the Byzantines back. Since they were attacking them from behind, this meant that they were pushing the Byzantines toward Carthage. But as they pushed the Romans through the valley, the same valley where the Roman cavalry had earlier defeated Gelimer's pinning force, Gelimer came upon his brother's men, fallen along the roadside, and the body of his brother shattered and broken upon the ground. And when he saw his brother, he wept. His men came to him for orders, but the only order he would give was that his brother be buried. His men milled about, anxiously waiting for battle commands, but Gelimer just would not respond to the situation at hand. Meanwhile, Belisarius, having been pushed through the valley, soon found...
Like, people are human. That is the sort of, like... You want people to be, like, clear-headed in these sorts of moments in battle or whatever. I don't know if he'd, like, experienced a loss quite like that in battle. Like, you don't expect people to be robots or whatever, but, like, to like, fall apart in a situation like that, it's only going to be detrimental to his men, which, you know, can't fully blame the guy, but damn, this is not going to work out for him very well. That's all I can really say.
Found himself reunited with his elite cavalry force. With these reinforcements, he regrouped and charged the now disorganized Vandal horde. The Vandal army broke and scattered out into the countryside. This force of Vandals that had been one push away from cutting Belisarius off from his cavalry, and perhaps ending the life of one of the greatest generals of late antiquity, that had been one push away from ending Justinian's dreams of a reunited Rome, was now dispersed. A day later, Belisarius marched into Carthage to a people who welcomed him as a liberator and hailed him as a hero. But Gelimer wasn't dead. He had escaped the battle, and so he called his other brother from Sardinia, where he had been putting down the revolt Justinian had helped orchestrate. With the aid of his brother's
forces, phone, or is that a...
planned another attack on Belisarius. This time, he'd be taking the fight to the walls of Carthage. Belisarius, fearing treachery from some of his mercenaries, opted to sally out of the city and meet Gelimer on the open field. The fighting was tough. No brilliant tactics, no clever flanking, just direct, grinding, brutal combat.
That's how I play Civ.
But just barely. The scales of war could tip either way. Then, during a Byzantine charge, Gelimer's other brother was cut down in front of him, and he fled the field. The Vandal forces would never recover from this defeat. They held out for a few months in the hills, but by spring, the Vandal kingdom had effectively disappeared. For his service, Justinian awarded Belisarius an honor that hadn't been seen outside the imperial family since the days of Augustus, 500 years before. A triumph, the greatest honor a Roman general could receive.
Oh, that's sick.
Belisarius and his troops marched with the spoils of war and the captives of the campaign through the streets of Byzantium to cheering throngs. But as he and the captive Vandal king stood before the emperor, Gelimer the Vandal lord was heard to say, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." This would be the last triumph Rome was ever to see. But we've not yet reached the apex of Justinian's achievements, nor of Belisarius's. Join us next time as the true reconquest of Rome begins.
So that one was definitely more military-based, which is cool. It's never been as much my thing, but that was really interesting. I feel like I've enjoyed learning about like Justinian's men more than actually learning about Justinian himself. He's kind of looming over the series rather than being like the main thing I think about. You know, he's definitely interesting, but I think I've liked a lot of the other guys more. Even Theodora, like the few times she wasn't even in this one, was she? It seems like she just kind of comes and goes with this. But yeah, it's really cool to be able to meet like a lot of these smaller figures that I wouldn't have known as much. Like Justinian, he's so popular among like history majors that I've encountered. So like I'm really glad to learn a little bit about him, but he's not been my favorite character so far. I think this episode has confirmed my favorite character thus far, but we'll see. We'll see if things end up changing. I'm curious to how some of the more domestic policies are going to come into play as we start to get further into this series, because like we had like the destruction of the previous episode, and we had the vague idea of them like rebuilding things, but we didn't really go into as much the process of there. And I'm curious to what the domestic situation is more like here, or if this is going to be more of the conqueror's perspective. But I guess we shall see, and that's my incentive to do these episodes more often than I have been, but we'll see how long it takes for me to get around to it. Thank you guys for watching. This was a lot of fun. Let me know what extra history stuff you'll want me to check out in the future. The poll is still up if you never ended up voting in it, to determine which series I'm going to do next. I'll be going to whichever one ends up being in second place. So if you didn't end up voting, you could probably still go back to that and get your vote in, and if for whatever, you could vote for whatever you think should come after this. And if that one's in second place, I'll end up doing it next. All right. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you tomorrow with another video. All right.